the only true God. What does the word idolatry suggest to your mind? Savages groveling before a totem pole? Cruel-faced statues in Hindu temples? The dervish dance of the priests of Baal around Elijah's altar? These things are certainly idolatrous in a very obvious way, but we need to realize that there are more subtle forms of idolatry as well. Look at the second commandment. It runs as follows. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. What is this commandment talking about? If it stood alone, it would be natural to suppose that it refers to the worship of images of gods other than Jehovah, the Babylonian idol worship, for instance, which Isaiah derided, or the paganism of the Greco-Roman world of Paul's day, of which he wrote in Romans chapter 1, verses 23 and 25, that they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man, and birds and animals and reptiles. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. But in its context, the second commandment can hardly be referring to this sort of idolatry, for if it were, it would simply be repeating the thought of the first commandment without adding anything to it. Accordingly, we take the second commandment, as in fact it has already been taken, as pointing us to the principle that, to quote Charles Hodge, idolatry consists not only in the worship of false gods, but also in the worship of the true God by images. In its Christian application, this means that we are not to make use of visual or pictorial representations of the triune God, or of any person of the Trinity, for the purposes of Christian worship. The commandment thus deals not with the object of our worship, but with the manner of it. What it tells us is that statues and pictures of the one whom we worship are not to be used as an aid to worshipping him. The dangers in images. It may seem strange at first that such a prohibition should find a place among the 10 basic principles of biblical religion, for at first sight it does not seem to have much point. What harm is there, we ask, in the worshipper surrounding himself with statues and pictures if they help him to lift his heart to God? We are accustomed to treating the question of whether these things should be used or not as a matter of temperament and personal taste. We know that some people have crucifixes and pictures of Christ in their rooms, and they tell us that looking at these objects helps them to focus their thoughts on Christ when they pray. We know that many claim to be able to worship more freely and more easily in churches that are filled with such ornaments than they can in churches that are bare of them. Well, we say, what is wrong with that? What harm can these things do? If people really do find them helpful, what more is there to be said? What point can there be in prohibiting them? In the face of this perplexity, some would suggest that the second commandment applies only to immoral and degrading representations of God borrowed from pagan cults, and to nothing more. But the very wording of the commandment rules out such a limiting exposition. God says quite categorically, "Thou shalt not make any likeness of anything for use in worship." This categorical statement rules out not simply the use of pictures and statues which depict God as an animal, but also the use of pictures and statues which depict him as the highest created thing we know, a human. It also rules out the use of pictures and statues of Jesus Christ as a man, although Jesus himself was and remains man. For all pictures and statues are necessarily made after the likeness of ideal manhood as we conceive it, and therefore come under the ban which the commandment imposes. Historically, Christians have differed as to whether the second commandment forbids the use of pictures of Jesus for purposes of teaching and instruction, in Sunday school classes, for instance. And the question is not an easy one to settle. But there is no room for doubting that the commandment obliges us to dissociate our worship, both in public and in private, from all pictures and statues of Christ, no less than from pictures and statues of his Father. But what, in that case, is the point of this comprehensive prohibition? From the emphasis given to the commandment itself, with a frightening sanction attached to it, the proclaiming of God's jealousy and his severity in punishing transgressors, one would suppose that this must really be a matter of crucial importance. But is it? The answer is yes. The Bible shows us that the glory of God and the spiritual well-being of humans are both directly bound up with it. Two lines of thought are set before us which together amply explain why this commandment should have been stressed so emphatically. These lines of thought relate not to the real or supposed helpfulness of images, but to the truth of them. They are as follows. 1. Images dishonor God, for they obscure his glory. The likeness of things in heaven, sun, moon, stars, and in earth, people, animals, birds, insects, and in the sea, fish, mammals, crustaceans, is precisely not a likeness of their Creator. A true image of God, wrote Calvin, is not to be found in all the world, and hence his glory is defiled, and his truth corrupted by the lie whenever he is set before our eyes in a visible form. Therefore, to devise any image of God is itself impious, because by this corruption his majesty is adulterated, and he is figured to be other than he is. The point here is not just that an image represents God as having body and parts, whereas in reality he has neither. If this were the only ground of objection to images, representations of Christ would be blameless. But the point really goes much deeper. The heart of the objection to pictures and images is that they inevitably conceal most, if not all, of the truth about the personal nature and character of the divine being whom they represent. To illustrate, Aaron made a golden calf, that is, a bull image. It was meant as a visible symbol of Jehovah, the mighty God who had brought Israel out of Egypt. No doubt the image was thought to honor him, as being a fitting symbol of his great strength, but it is not hard to see that such a symbol in fact insults him. For what idea of his moral character, his righteousness, goodness, and patience could one gather from looking at a statue of him as a bull? Thus, Aaron's image hid Jehovah's glory. In a similar way, the pathos of the crucifix obscures the glory of Christ, for it hides the fact of his deity, his victory on the cross, and his present kingdom. It displays his human weakness, but it conceals his divine strength. It depicts the reality of his pain, but keeps out of our sight the reality of his joy and his power. In both these cases, the symbol is unworthy most of all because of what it fails to display. And so are all other visible representations of deity. Whatever we may think of religious art from a cultural standpoint, we should not look to pictures of God to show us his glory and move us to worship. For his glory is precisely what such pictures can never show us. And this is why God added to the second commandment a reference to himself as jealous, to avenge himself on those who disobey him. For God's jealousy in the Bible is his zeal to maintain his own glory, which is jeopardized when images are used in worship. In Isaiah chapter 40, verse 18, after vividly declaring God's immeasurable greatness, the scripture asks us, "To whom then will you compare God? What image will you compare him to?" The question does not expect an answer, only a chastened silence. Its purpose is to remind us that it is as absurd as it is impious to think that an image modeled as images must be upon some creature could be an acceptable likeness of the Creator. Nor is this the only reason why we are forbidden to use images in worship. 2.